With the election of Alicia Stallings, American poet, to the chair of poetry at Oxford, I think it's fitting that we spend some time talking about what American poetry is. You could argue that with Stallings' elevation to the chair of poetry in 2023, American poetry had finally come of age. I want to spend the next few videos giving you a short history of American poetry. Defining American poetry can be tricky. In one sense, if we could take a just national approach, it would be pretty simple. We could say, well, there's a country, the United States of America. If a poet is a citizen of the United States of America, then they're an American poet, and what they produce is American poetry. This can work, and yet there's a good 150 years almost of writing in America before the United States of America is an independent nation. What do we do with that writing? Further, what do we do with Americans who live most of their lives overseas and write poetry overseas? Is that American poetry? What about these borders? We have this northern border with Canada and the southern border with Mexico. If I'm a poet writing in Mexico, I'm living in the New World. Technically, I'm still in the continent of North America. Can my poetry be called American poetry? If I'm a Canadian poet and I live most of my life in Toronto, but have a teaching post, say, in Buffalo, New York, am I an American writer or a Canadian writer? Mostly, these questions have been answered. And I don't know that they've been answered satisfactorily, but if you look at a history of American poetry or get an anthology of American poetry, what you'll mostly see is poetry written in English by people who lived in what would become the United States of America from the 1600s through the late 1700s. And then starting in the late 1700s, poetry by people who were born in America, even if they didn't live there all their life. A good example of this would be someone like T.S. Eliot. T.S. Eliot was born in St. Louis, Missouri. He grew up in America. He went to Harvard University. But after his undergraduate study, he moved to England and spent most of his time in England, sometime in Germany, sometime in France. But most of his life was in England. But his poetry is still considered American poetry because it's by an American. He even took on British citizenship. That didn't make him a British poet, at least in how we categorize poetry. Is that fair? Well, I'm not sure. I want to introduce you, though, to the movers and shakers of American poetry, and hopefully poke a little bit at some of the questions that I still think need meditating on when it comes to American identity and poetic identity in America. American poetry has a pretty identifiable starting point. In 1612, a girl named Anne was born in England. Anne ended up marrying in her teen years a man named Simon Bradstreet. And so Anne Bradstreet is the name she had for most of her life. When she was a teenager, she moved with her new husband and her father to the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And her husband and father both worked for the government, the colonial government there in Massachusetts. Anne became a mother. She had a hard life. She had one of those lives that you study in American history in elementary school. These people who come to America, they're Puritans, maybe they don't quite agree with all of what's going on in England religiously, but they have to kind of eke out difficult lives on this eastern coast of the New World. That was Anne Bradstreet. And Anne Bradstreet, maybe we wouldn't know anything about her other than maybe having her name in the Massachusetts Bay Colony Register, except that from a young age, Anne wrote poetry. And in 1650, her brother-in-law decided to put together some of the poems that he had in his possession that she had written and publish them in London under the title, "The 10th Muse Lately Sprung Up in America." Let me read you one of those poems. If ever two were one, then surely we, If ever man were loved by wife, then thee. If ever wife was happy in a man, compare with me, ye women, if ye can. I prize thy love more than whole mines of gold, or all the riches that the east doth hold. My love is such that rivers cannot quench, nor aught but love from thee give recompense. Thy love is such I can no way repay. The heavens reward thee manifold, I pray. Then while we live, in love let's so persever, that when we live no more, we may live ever. This is 4 quatrains of iambic pentameter, rhyming AA, BB, CC, DD, etc. It sounds a little bit like Shakespeare, to be honest, and if you're Anne Bradstreet writing in the 1640s about how much you love your significant other, Shakespeare is looming large in the background. In 1623, when she was still a girl, before she moved to America, the first folio of Shakespeare's plays would have been published in London. Anne Bradstreet would have known of Shakespeare. Shakespeare would have been in the air. She was a contemporary of people like John Donne, another great love poet, contemporary of Milton, who was also writing poetry, not so much love poetry, but poetry in iambic pentameter that was very masterful, both in its meter and rhyme. And so even as she is inheriting the Shakespearean tradition, even as she's a peer of people like Donne and Milton, she's writing a poetry that distinguish itself as significantly different from them for a couple of reasons. One, she's a woman. Now, it's not that no women wrote poetry in this age, but women weren't the expected sort of dominant class that were writing poetry. Second, she's living in and speaking from the New World colonies. And this immediately creates in her a little bit of an outsider, kind of exotic perspective, but also a perspective that is respectable by people living in England. They look at her and they say, wow, she's doing a difficult thing. She has a more difficult, maybe even brave, honorable life than we do. Now, maybe some of her readers, if they were, say, Anglo-Catholic or even Roman Catholic, would have seen her Puritanism as, suspect, or, she's the wrong kind of Christian. And I think it's very curious, this poem, maybe her most famous poem, this is called To My Dear and Loving Husband. This poem is a love poem that has a little bit of passion in it and a little bit of boasting. If ever wife was happy in a man, compare with me, ye women, if you can. Like, hey, I don't think your relationship with your husband in its, love is measuring up to mine. Like, I'm happier with my man than you are with your man. It's a little bit of a kind of a rap boast, as we would understand it today. There's explicit desire and passion expressed in this poem, and yet, given that it's coming from a woman and a wife and a Puritan, it's illicit desire and passion. This isn't, a steamy love affair poem like we might find in Shakespeare's sonnets, where Shakespeare says, I love you, but I know I shouldn't. We should never be together. This is a proper love, and it's the highest kind of love. And we have this very paradisical image at the end where she says, while we live in love, let's so persever. It's an old pronunciation of persevere. That when we live no more, that is when we're in paradise, we may live ever. We'll have sort of spousal happiness together forever in heaven. It's very Christian, it's very Puritan, it's very passionate, and it's very feminine in its expression of love for a husband. This is sort of the idealization, not just of a husband, but of the husband-wife relationship. It's creating a new American ideal. Let's compare Anne Bradstreet to another poet who was writing a little after her in the mid to late 1600s, a woman named Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz. Now, Sor Juana was born and raised in Mexico. She ended up becoming a nun in Mexico City in the Hieronymite order. And she also wrote poetry, sometimes love poetry, more love poetry about God or friendship with other women and men. But she wrote from a perspective of a woman in the New World. And I think Sor Juana and Anne Bradstreet are interesting in that they both are these feminine voices, these female voices from the New World that are very consciously not part of the European tradition anymore. In fact, Anne Bradstreet, she's an English speaker, born and raised. She only speaks English in America. She doesn't learn, the Ojibwe language, for instance, of the indigenous peoples of the Northeast. Sor Juana did learn the indigenous language, Nahuatl, of Mexico, and she both spoke and wrote Nahuatl and in Spanish. And Sor Juana actually ended up getting in trouble because she wrote so openly both about theology, about love, about worldly affairs and spiritual matters that a bishop ended up censuring her and saying, hey, you shouldn't be writing anything. Aren't women supposed to stay silent? And she wrote this spirited defense, which is now famous. It's not a poem, but this spirited defense saying, hey, look, my poetry and my prose, for what it's worth, is coming from a woman who studies scripture, a woman who knows theology, a woman who knows the poetic, the literary, both secular and sacred tradition. And not only can women speak and write, not only is it allowable, but it's magnificent. And so she got further censured and ended up, she ended up serving the poor during a plague and dying during a plague. And I think one of the interesting things about both Bradstreet and Sor Juana is that they faced difficult lives as women in the New World in the 1600s. These were not easy, cushy lives. This wasn't the French court or, London aristocracy. They were living with fewer resources than most other women of their class, of the upper classes of Europe. One poem that I think is interesting in this regards when it comes to Bradstreet is a poem that she wrote about her house burning down. So this is called Verses Upon the Burning of Our House. And the poem is rather long. It opens with a sort of alarm in the middle of the night. The house is burning. And, we have these wooden structures built by the colonists. They're not steel girders like we have now in modern fireproof buildings. The poem, though, isn't just a dramatic narrative about a house burning down. There's meditation that we get. We get kind of Bradstreet's wisdom, her especially Puritan-tinged wisdom, in the second half of this poem. She says, When by the ruins oft I passed, my sorrowing eye aside did cast, and here and there the places spy, where oft I sat, and long did lie. Here stood that trunk, and there that chest, there lay the store I counted best. My pleasant things in ashes lie, and then behold, no more shall I. This sort of wistfulness for whenever I go past the place where I used to live, I remember all those common things, all those things that were mine. But then she kind of calls to her soul. She says, Then straight I gin my heart to chide, and did thy wealth on earth abide? Didst fix thy hope on mouldering dust? The arm of flesh didst make thy trust? Raise up thy thoughts above the sky, that dunghill mists away may fly. Thou hast a house on high erect, framed by that mighty architect, who with glory richly furnished, stands permanent, though this be fled. It's purchased and it's paid for too, by him who hath enough to do, a price so vast as is unknown, yet by his gift is made thine own. There's wealth enough, I need no more. Farewell my pelf, farewell my store. The world no longer let me love. My hope and treasure lie above. So this has a very heavenly focus, as the verses to the husband have. And I think we could see maybe a major theme in this early American poetry from this colonial mind of Bradstreet. This trying to figure out the balance between the worth of the things we love on earth, which are temporal, which will die, and the worth of a heavenly vision, a heavenly hope and expectation. Further, I think that's increased by the New World setting. That's increased by knowing, hey, I'm here in New England. She even has a poem, Bradstreet does, and Sor Juana has a similar poem, that are dialogues between the Old World and the New World. And the Old World, in the 1600s, especially mid to 1600s, in England especially, we have a civil war going on. The Puritans who didn't go to America, they stay and end up having a war with the king and his Anglo-Catholic faction. It's bad in England. And both Sor Juana and Bradstreet see the New World as perhaps a sort of newer, younger, more hopeful sibling or friend that can encourage the Old World and maybe do things differently, not end up in the same place the Old World was. We spent a lot of time on Bradstreet and kind of compared her to Sor Juana, and you might think, maybe only women wrote poetry in the New World in the 1600s. And it's true that the major poetry, the most lasting poetry we have from the colonial era in American poetry is by women. There were other writers, though. Edward Taylor, who was not known well in his day, he wrote in the late 1600s, early 1700s, he also writes a Puritan-focused poetry, very much about, the justice of God and the gratefulness of man, Christ as our great advocate, and he even has these courtroom scenes where Christ is the lawyer and God the Father is the judge, and we, the sinner, are the defendant. One thing that I think makes Bradstreet and Sor Juana so interesting is that they are voices that we now see as important to champion, but they're voices that even in their own day, it's not like no one was reading them, and today we're like, well, we need to find some, women who wrote too. These women were the great masters of poetry in their age, and they set a standard that we now look back to. Let's look, as we close out this beginning section, let's look at one last poem by Anne Bradstreet, the prologue, to sing of wars, of captains and of kings, of cities founded, commonwealths begun, for my mean pen are two superior things. Or how they all or each their dates have run. Let's poets and historians set these forth. My obscure line shall not so dim their worth. I am obnoxious. This is a little later in the poem. I am obnoxious to each carping tongue, who says my hand a needle better fits. A poet's pen all scorn I should thus wrong, for such despite they cast on female wits. If what I do prove well, it won't advance. They'll say it was stolen, or else by chance. But share the ancient Greeks, were far more mild. Else of our sex, why feigned they those 9, and Poesy made Calliope's own child? So mongst the rest they place the arts divine, but this weak knot they will full soon untie. The Greeks did not but play the fools and lie. Let Greeks be Greeks, and women what they are. Men have precedency, and still excel. It is but vain unjustly to wage war. Men can do best, and women know it well. Preeminence in all and each is yours, yet grant some small acknowledgement of ours. There's this sort of like, oh no, men do things better. Oh yeah, those old Greeks, they sang of wars, and I can't do that. But, let me slip in. Let me have my say. This was a poem that's often put at the beginning of her collections of poetry. And it's this sort of subtle, like, just let me get in and have my say. And then she gives us the first great masterpieces of American poetry. And Sor Juana is doing that in England, or in Mexico too. Sor Juana is a little more bold in her defense of women. There's a slyness, a sort of demureness that is so winning and so like, oh no, she's not asking for much, that Bradstreet then establishes herself as our great foremother of poetry. And all the poetry we look at after her, in one sense, flows from her. We might not agree with how she writes poetry, we might not agree with her theology or politics, and yet we are all indebted to her for being our founding mother of American poetry.